August 1945. The Pacific was burning. The Empire of Japan, once the master of swift offensives and mechanical precision, now faced an enemy it had underestimated for far too long. In the rolling plains of China and the shattered outskirts of Manchuria, armored warfare, something Japan had never truly mastered, was about to deliver one final, humbling lesson. And on that battlefield stood two machines that would symbolize the shifting tides of power: Japan's Chi-Nus medium tank, proud but outdated, and the British, designed, American, deployed Sherman Firefly, an engine of destruction capable of piercing even the strongest armor with a single, thunderous strike. What the Japanese soldiers witnessed in those last days of the war would haunt them forever. They had faced artillery, aircraft, and endless naval bombardment, but never before had they seen a tank that could destroy theirs in one shot from nearly a mile away. To them, the Firefly was not a tank. It was judgment itself, rolling forward in fire and smoke. The story of how Japan came to face the Sherman Firefly is one of denial, desperation, and the deadly evolution of technology. During the early years of the Second World War, Japanese tank doctrine had been shaped by experiences in China. Against weakly armed infantry, poor defenses, and almost no enemy armor, their tanks like the Chi and later the Chi-Nus were built not for duels, but for support, fast, lightly armored, with modest guns designed to shatter bunkers or chase retreating troops. Against infantry and colonial forces, they had seemed powerful, but against modern steel, against the new generation of Allied tanks, their armor might as well have been paper. By 1944, the world had changed. In Europe, the Allies had landed in Normandy. In the Pacific, America had leapfrogged through island after island, grinding down Japanese resistance with overwhelming firepower. And as the Americans advanced, they brought with them an unexpected weapon: the British Firefly, a modified M4 Sherman mounting the powerful 17-pounder anti-tank gun. It was the answer to the German Tiger and Panther, a weapon built out of necessity and desperation in Europe, now carried eastward as the Allies prepared for Japan's final stand. When the Firefly first arrived in the Pacific theater, few Japanese commanders took notice. Reports described it simply as a variant of the Sherman. But the truth was far more ominous. The 17-pounder gun could destroy almost any tank in the world with a single shot at ranges where most Japanese crews could barely see their target. Its shell could punch through 140 millimeters of armor at 1,000 yards, more than enough to turn the Chi-Nus, with its thin, riveted plates, into burning wreckage. On the dry plains outside Nanjing and in the defensive belts around Kyushu, small armored clashes began to unfold. Japanese Chi-Nus rolled forward with their 75mm Type 3 guns, proud, newly built, a symbol of Japan's attempt to modernize its tank force before the inevitable Allied invasion. But the Fireflies that faced them were faster, sharper, and deadlier than anything they had imagined. The first encounters were over in seconds. The Chi-Nus, painted in jungle camouflage, would advance in cautious formation. Then, from over a ridge or behind a shattered village, a single white flash, the Firefly's muzzle erupting with blinding light. Moments later, the lead Chi-Nus would explode, turret thrown into the air. To the Japanese crews inside those tanks, it must have felt like being struck by lightning. They had never trained to fight at such range, nor to withstand such firepower. Survivors recalled seeing comrades disappear in an instant, their tanks torn open like tin. It was as if the gods had fired upon us. One Japanese tank officer later said, "We didn't even see the enemy, only the flash." As reports spread, fear began to ripple through Japan's armored divisions. They called the Firefly, the tank that sees from a mountain, a poetic description of its uncanny ability to strike from unseen distances. Many believed the Firefly was guided by spotters in the sky, or that it carried new, mystical shells that could pierce anything. In truth, it was simply the brutal arithmetic of modern warfare. Technology had outpaced courage. In Tokyo, senior officers reviewed the battlefield reports with growing alarm. The Chi-Nus had been meant to restore balance, to give Japan a fighting chance against American Shermans. But now, against the Firefly, it was obsolete before it had even fought its war. The Type 3 gun, once celebrated for its power, was nearly useless against the Firefly's sloped armor. Japanese shells shattered harmlessly on its hull, while the Firefly's 17-pounder turned theirs into twisted wrecks. For the tank crews, the experience was devastating. Many had joined the armored corps out of pride, believing the tank to be the future of Japanese warfare. They trained in secrecy, isolated from the infantry, told that they would lead Japan's final defense. But on the field, they realized they were not predators, they were prey. The Firefly's gunners, trained in Europe's fiercest battles, were mercilessly efficient. They fired once, adjusted, and fired again. Each shot was surgical, cold, and final. By mid-1945, the Firefly had gained a dark reputation among Japanese soldiers. They began calling it the long-range killer. Some used a more haunting phrase, the Iron Ghost. Its presence on the field shattered morale. Japanese infantry refused to advance with their tanks once they saw the Fireflies hidden in the hills. Even anti-tank guns, Japan's last line of defense, could not reach the distances the Firefly could engage from. One Japanese officer, in a final dispatch from the Philippines, wrote, "Our tanks burn before they can see the enemy. The Americans' weapons are beyond our science. To face them is to die standing." It was not exaggeration. It was despair. As the war neared its end, Japan's tank factories struggled to keep up. Materials were scarce, fuel was vanishing, and the homeland was being bombed daily. The Chi-Nus, produced in small numbers, became a relic almost instantly. It was too late to redesign, too late to counter. Against the might of Allied engineering, the Japanese tank arm had no answer. When Allied forces finally landed on Japanese soil, most Chi-Nus never even saw battle. They were hidden, dug into defensive positions as static bunkers, their crews waiting for a battle that never came. Yet stories persisted. Rumors of Fireflies waiting in the distance, watching, ready to strike the moment a turret moved. The legend of the one-shot kill had taken root, and in the hearts of Japanese soldiers, it became almost supernatural. For those who survived, the memory lingered long after the surrender. They would describe the sound, the distant crack that meant death was coming. No roar of engines, no clatter of tracks, just silence, then a flash, and then nothing. For many, that single experience defined the end of Japan's dream of armored warfare. The empire that had once prided itself on discipline and courage was brought to its knees by precision and range. The Firefly, though small in number, left an enormous shadow in history. It proved that in war, evolution is relentless and arrogance is fatal. The same machine that had faced German tigers in Normandy now shattered Japan's last hopes for a steel defense. Its gun, once a symbol of Allied ingenuity, became to the Japanese what the thunder god was in myth: unstoppable, unseen, and absolute. In the ruins of Tokyo, as American tanks rolled in, many Japanese officers studied captured Fireflies in silence. They walked around them like men observing a divine artifact. The long barrel of the 17 Pounder seemed impossibly large, its precision terrifying. Some engineers even admitted they had never imagined such a weapon could exist. One whispered, "If we had known this was coming, we would never have gone to war." The war in the Pacific ended not just with bombs and surrender, but with the realization that Japan's military, once proud of its ingenuity, had been overtaken by a world that evolved faster than it could imagine. The Firefly was not merely a weapon, it was a message from the future. And when its shells tore through the Chi-Nus in those last, fading battles, they did more than destroy steel. They shattered belief, pride, and illusion. For every Japanese tank crew who burned in those final days, there were stories untold. Young men who had never seen a Firefly, only its work. Villagers who saw fields of smoke where their defenders once stood. Engineers who wept over blueprints that had arrived too late. And somewhere, across the Pacific, an Allied gunner reloaded his 17-pounder and watched his shot arc perfectly through the dawn light, unaware that in that single act, an entire military tradition was ending. In war, power shifts not with nations, but with moments, small flashes of brilliance that redefine everything that came before. The Sherman Firefly was one such moment. Against Japan's Chi-Nus, it proved that technology can crush valor, that precision can silence fury, and that even empires built on devotion and honor can fall to a single, well-aimed shot. The 17-pounder gun that gave the Sherman Firefly its devastating power was born out of desperation, necessity, and sheer ingenuity. In 1943, the British Army faced an existential problem on the battlefields of Europe. German Tiger and Panther tanks dominated every engagement, their thick armor turning Allied shells into useless sparks. British 6-pounder and American 75mm guns could barely scratch them, forcing Allied crews into ranged duels where the odds were overwhelmingly against them. The 17-pounder, a new 76.2mm anti-tank gun, had been developed as a response, a weapon capable of punching through even the heaviest German armor at long range. Yet mounting such a massive gun on a tank seemed nearly impossible. Its length, recoil, and ammunition size made it unsuitable for most Allied vehicles. Until a small group of British engineers decided to make the impossible real. Working in secret, they began modifying the M4 Sherman, the most widely available Allied tank. They reconfigured the turret, adjusted the breech, and even mounted the gun at an angle to fit the longer barrel. Ammunition racks were stripped and rearranged, and the radio was moved to the rear of the turret in a distinctive, armored box. The result was crude, improvised, and utterly transformative. The Firefly was born, a tank that looked ordinary but carried the firepower of a giant. The British War Office was skeptical at first, but in combat, it became legendary. German tankers soon learned to fear the Firefly's long barrel, often ordering their gunners to destroy it first whenever they spotted one among the ranks of ordinary Shermans. When this weapon made its way to the Pacific theater, its presence was almost accidental. The American and British forces had initially expected lighter resistance from Japanese tanks, which were smaller, thinner, and used outdated weaponry. But by late 1944, intelligence suggested that Japan was producing a new medium tank, the Chi-Nus, with a 70mm gun capable of piercing older Shermans. In anticipation of tougher armor, a limited number of Fireflies were shipped east. They arrived as part of the growing Allied buildup for the invasion of the Japanese home islands, bringing with them a level of tank killing power the Pacific had never seen. For the Japanese, who had rarely encountered heavily armed tanks, the 17-pounder was a nightmare. Its muzzle velocity was over 900 feet per second. enough to cut through nearly any armored target with a single round. Where Japanese Type 3 shells from the Chi-Nus could penetrate roughly 7,900 of armor at 500 meters, the Firefly's 17-pounder could penetrate double that at nearly twice the distance. The difference wasn't merely numerical. It was psychological. Allied crews knew they could destroy enemy armor before being seen, while Japanese tankers often advanced blindly into the killing range of an unseen enemy whose first shot was almost always the last. Unlike the Pacific's chaotic jungle warfare, where tanks often fought in close quarters, the Firefly's gun encouraged stand-off tactics. From ridgelines, fields, and ruined villages, it could unleash precise shots that turned Japanese armor into fireballs. American and British gunners trained meticulously, calculating range, wind, and angle with near scientific precision. The Firefly's recoil thundered like a cannon from another world, its shell cutting through air with a shriek that echoed across valleys. Every time one fired, it left behind a plume of smoke and the unmistakable scent of cordite, a grim signature of death delivered from afar. Japanese crews, used to exchanging fire at close range, were bewildered. Their shells bounced harmlessly off the Firefly's front armor, while the return fire tore through their tanks like paper. Witnesses described tanks erupting in fire after a single hit, their ammunition cooking off in violent bursts. Survivors would crawl from hatches only to find the enemy tank still hidden beyond the horizon. The Firefly's reach was such that many Japanese never even saw it. To them, the destruction seemed divine, an invisible force of Western engineering and vengeance. Even among Allied crews, there was respect for the 17-pounder's sheer force. Many tankers said they could feel the gun's power through their bones when it fired, a shock wave that rattled every rivet in the vehicle. It demanded precision, restraint, and nerves of steel to wield properly. In the Pacific, where most engagements were short and brutal, it was a rare weapon that could end battles before they even began. Each shell carried not just destruction, but the legacy of Europe's deadliest confrontations transplanted to a new theater. By the time the war neared its end, the Firefly had become more than a weapon. It was a legend. To the Allies, it symbolized the triumph of innovation over fear. To the Japanese, it represented something far darker, the end of armored warfare as they knew it. In the clash between the Firefly's 17-pounder and Japan's Chi-Nus, technology wasn't just decisive, it was absolute. The weapon born to kill tigers had found new prey in the Pacific, and once again, it did what it was built to do: end a battle before it truly began. When the Sherman Firefly first appeared in the Pacific theater, it brought with it an aura of mystery and quiet dread. Few Japanese officers even knew such a machine existed. The Imperial Japanese Army, accustomed to lighter tanks designed for mobility and jungle warfare, had never before faced a weapon with such devastating power. The Chi-Nus, Japan's most advanced tank by late 1944, was meant to restore balance against American armor. With its Type 375mm gun and improved armor, it represented Japan's last serious attempt to match Western tank technology. But on the open plains and volcanic ridges of the Pacific Islands, even this final hope would prove hopelessly outmatched. Japanese tank doctrine had always been different from that of the West. Instead of relying on heavy armor and massive guns, Japan built its tanks around speed, reliability, and ease of transport. The empire's early conquests in China, Malaya, and the Philippines reinforced this belief. Most of the enemy armor they faced was light, outdated, or non-existent. Tanks were used primarily for infantry support, not tank-on-tank combat. That doctrine crumbled the moment the Firefly arrived. The first encounters between these two machines were short, violent, and one-sided. Allied gunners could destroy a Chi-Nus from over 500 meters away, long before the Japanese crews even spotted them through their narrow vision slits. Reports from the field tell a grim story. On the island of Luzon in early 1945, an Allied tank platoon positioned on a ridgeline intercepted a small column of Japanese armor moving through a narrow valley. The Firefly's commander watched through his periscope as the Chi-Nus advanced in tight formation, unaware of what waited above. The first shot came without warning. A single 17-pounder shell pierced the lead tank's glacis plate and detonated its ammunition storage. The explosion was so fierce it lit the sky, sending debris and flame across the valley. Within seconds, the column halted, confusion spreading through the Japanese ranks. 2 more shells followed, striking with surgical precision. By the time the smoke cleared, 3 tanks burned in silence. None had fired a single shot in return. Such moments became common in the final stages of the Pacific War. Japanese tankers described the Firefly's attack as strikes from a hidden demon. Its long barrel could reach across distances that Japanese optics could not measure. Even veteran commanders struggled to comprehend how their armor could be breached from so far away. Crews began painting extra camouflage, draping branches, and even using temple ruins for cover. But nothing stopped the Firefly's gun from finding its mark. The sound of its shell tearing through the air was described as a whistle of death, often followed by an eruption of flame that consumed everything inside the vehicle. For the men inside the Chi-Nus, there was no answer. Their own guns could penetrate a Firefly only at dangerously close ranges, often less than 500 meters. Closing that distance meant driving through open ground under enemy observation, an act that bordered on suicide. Many Japanese tankers chose instead to ambush Allied infantry, knowing their tanks were hopeless in a stand-up fight. Some even removed the turrets and buried the hulls, turning their tanks into static gun emplacements. But even these desperate tactics failed against the Firefly's range and accuracy. Its shells would rip through fortifications, shredding steel and soil alike. Among Allied crews, the Firefly earned a reputation for invincibility. Its operators were trained to stay disciplined, to take careful aim, fire once, and then relocate before counterfire could arrive. They knew the psychological weight their weapon carried. The mere sight of the Firefly's elongated gun barrel was enough to unnerve enemy observers. German tankers in Europe had once referred to it as the sniper Sherman, and now, in the Pacific, that legacy continued. Japanese spotters often mistook it for an artillery piece because of its range, never realizing it was a tank until it was too late. The Firefly's impact extended beyond the battlefield. In captured diaries and reports, Japanese officers wrote of facing an enemy machine that did not belong to this world. They called it unnatural, its accuracy divine, its destruction absolute. For soldiers raised in the spirit of Bushido, where courage could overcome fear, such encounters tested their faith. No amount of bravery could close the gap between 75 non-univert and 17-pounder firepower. It wasn't just a defeat of machines, but of belief itself. The realization that even the strongest will could not withstand the cold, mechanical precision of modern warfare. By 1945, as Japan's industrial capacity crumbled, the Chi-Nus became a symbol of futility. Fewer than 200 were ever produced, and most never left the home islands. In contrast, the Allies produced hundreds of Fireflies, refining their tactics with every engagement. The imbalance was staggering. Each Firefly destroyed represented months of Japanese labor and dwindling resources. Each Chi-Nus lost was a blow not just to the army, but to the illusion that Japan could ever regain technological parity. The tank duels of 1945 were brief, brutal, and prophetic, foreshadowing the technological dominance that would define post-war warfare. In those final months, when the empire stood on the brink of collapse, the image of burning Chi-Nus haunted Japanese soldiers. The Firefly had become more than a tank, it was a specter of inevitability. Its 17-pounder shells carried not just explosive force, but the weight of an empire's downfall. Every shot fired in those last battles marked another step toward the end, another reminder that courage alone could no longer turn the tide of war. The arrival of the Sherman Firefly shattered what little balance remained in the Pacific's tank warfare. By early 1945, Japanese commanders on the front lines began reporting what they could only describe as impossible events. Tanks being destroyed from unseen distances, armor pierced clean through, and entire platoons wiped out before even identifying the direction of fire. For the Imperial Japanese Army, these reports were not just disturbing, they were demoralizing. The Chi-Nus, Japan's most advanced armored design, had been built in quiet desperation, conceived in factories that still bore the scars of Allied bombings. Engineers had promised their generals that this new tank, armed with a Type 375 mm gun, could finally stand toe-to-toe with the American Sherman. What they did not anticipate was the Firefly, a variant so powerful it made even the Chi-Nus feel like a relic. The first real encounters came in the Philippines and Burma, where Allied units equipped with Fireflies supported infantry advances through dense terrain. Japanese armor units, already outnumbered and under-supplied, faced a nightmare they could neither counter nor understand. The Firefly's 17-pounder gun was not merely a bigger cannon. It was a weapon that redefined range, accuracy, and lethality. It could penetrate nearly 150 millimeters of armor at over 1,000 yards, something no Japanese tank could withstand. The Chi-Nus sloped plating, which had been designed to deflect lighter shells, offered no protection at all. When a Firefly round struck, the result was catastrophic. The impact turned the interior of the tank into a furnace. Fuel ignited, ammunition detonated, and crews were lost before they could even shout a warning. In one engagement near the outskirts of Manila, Allied scouts observed a group of Japanese Chi-Nus attempting to flank an infantry column. The Fireflies positioned themselves across an open rice field, using the terrain to mask their movements. The first shot landed with terrifying precision. It was said that the shell passed clean through the lead Chi-Nus, exciting out the rear armor before exploding in the tank behind it. Survivors from that battle described the scene as instant annihilation. 2 tanks destroyed in less than 10 seconds, the rest retreating in confusion. For the Americans, it was just another skirmish. For the Japanese, it was a moment of revelation. They were no longer fighting equals. They were fighting ghosts, machines that struck from invisible distances with godlike accuracy. As word of the Firefly spread through Japanese ranks, fear began to take hold. Tank crews started painting makeshift camouflage, covering their hulls with foliage or nets. Some units began moving only at night, relying on moonlight to hide their positions. But even darkness offered no real protection. The Firefly's crews had mastered the art of concealment, firing from shadowed ridges, from jungle clearings, from positions the Japanese never suspected. To those who survived, it felt as though the very landscape was turning against them. A tank destroyed by unseen fire was not just a loss of steel, but a blow to morale. A reminder of helplessness in the face of superior technology. Even within Japanese command circles, frustration and disbelief spread. Officers debated how to respond. Could they close the distance? Could they lure the Fireflies into ambushes or draw them into terrain too dense for maneuvering? In theory, yes. But in reality, their tanks lacked the power to strike back. The Chi-Nus 75mm gun could only penetrate a Sherman's armor at dangerously close ranges, often under 500 meters. To achieve that, a crew would need to expose themselves completely to enemy fire, hoping the Firefly would miss. It never did. The result was always the same: a single glowing tracer, a thunderous explosion, and silence. For American crews, the Firefly felt like an equalizer. Many had fought against German Tigers and Panthers in Europe, tanks that had haunted their nightmares with overwhelming armor and firepower. Now, with the 17-pounder, they felt a confidence they'd never known before. They called it the long arm of retribution. In the Pacific, it gave them control over every open stretch of land, every ridge, every plain where tanks could move. Japanese units soon avoided confrontation entirely, retreating their armor into defensive positions, using their tanks more as artillery than as mobile strike weapons. On the battlefield, this imbalance created a haunting rhythm. The Firefly would strike once, and the world would go still. Smoke rose from the wreckage, black and thick, the jungle echoing with the crackling of burning steel. The surviving Japanese soldiers would stare from their trenches, unable to help the men inside, unable to even approach. There was nothing to repair, nothing to recover. Only the lingering scent of oil and death remained. By the end of the war, Japanese engineers realized the futility of further tank development. They had tried everything: improving armor, modifying guns, adjusting tactics. But it was too late. Their industry could no longer compete. The Firefly was a symbol of Allied mastery, the product of an industrial machine that Japan could never match. What the Japanese called lightning death became the lasting memory of their armored corps. In the closing days of the conflict, when the skies burned with firebombs and cities turned to ash, the legend of the Firefly spread not as a tale of enemy glory, but as a grim reminder that the age of mechanical warfare had left them behind. As the months of 1945 dragged on, the Japanese army found itself retreating not only across islands, but across time itself, trapped in an outdated doctrine while the Allies moved forward into a new era of mechanized dominance. The Sherman Firefly stood as the embodiment of that transformation, a weapon that represented the industrial and tactical superiority of the West, an instrument that no amount of spirit or bravery could overcome. In every encounter where the Chi-Nus appeared, the outcome was preordained. The Firefly didn't just destroy tanks, it dismantled the very idea that courage alone could alter the course of war. The psychological toll on Japanese crews was immense. Many of them were young men, barely trained, some barely adults, thrust into machines that rattled and smoked, with thin armor that echoed under enemy fire. They were taught that the will to die, for the Emperor, could overcome any weapon. But when they faced the Firefly, that belief crumbled under the crushing weight of modern firepower. They would watch their shells bounce harmlessly off distant silhouettes, then see a blinding flash and feel their world end in a heartbeat. Survivors spoke of moments where time seemed to freeze. The flash of the enemy gun, the sound of metal tearing apart, the sudden rush of flame and heat. There was no glory in those deaths, only silence and disbelief. In the Pacific jungles and across the plains of Luzon and Okinawa, the Firefly's reputation grew into something mythic. Even infantrymen whispered about it, describing it as an invincible giant with eyes that could see through the dark. Japanese tank commanders began refusing direct confrontation, choosing instead to bury their tanks, turning them into fixed bunkers that could at least deliver a single volley before being destroyed. But the Firefly adapted as well. Allied crews learned to hunt these hidden threats with precision, using spotters and reconnaissance planes to locate positions before striking with ruthless efficiency. Each engagement became a carefully choreographed execution, a single shell, a plume of smoke, and then nothing. The Chi-Nus, Japan's last hope for armored parity, had been built on desperation. Its design drew from the lessons of earlier defeats, from the fragile Go and the obsolete Chi-Ha. Engineers had worked feverishly in secret, knowing that Japan's resources were dwindling. They used lighter steel, thinner armor, and improvised parts scavenged from damaged vehicles. When the tanks finally rolled out of the factories, they were already outdated. Against a 17-pounder shell, even the best armor Japan could produce might as well have been paper. And yet, the crews entered battle with the same unwavering conviction, a reflection of a culture where surrender was unthinkable and death was an honor. The contrast between the two sides could not have been starker. On one side, Allied tank crews, confident in their machines, fought with discipline and precision, relying on advanced optics, superior communication, and the coordination of artillery and air support. On the other, Japanese crews operated in isolation, with limited fuel, poor visibility, and almost no logistical backing. They were outmatched in every measurable way. The Firefly represented not just a weapon, but an entire system. A war machine fueled by industry, innovation, and relentless adaptation. Every time its gun roared, it spoke the language of modernity, a declaration that the age of industrial warfare had fully arrived. The emotional impact of these clashes extended far beyond the battlefield. For Japanese commanders, each destroyed Chi-Nus was another reminder of their nation's fragility. Reports grew grim. Requests for reinforcements went unanswered, ammunition ran low, and fuel convoys were annihilated before reaching the front. Tank crews began writing farewell notes before each mission, aware that they were unlikely to return. One survivor from the 2nd Armored Regiment later recalled, "We fought in iron coffins. We could hear the Firefly before we saw it. When it struck, everything ended in one heartbeat. We prayed not to burn." His words captured what numbers could not: the raw, human despair behind Japan's armored war effort. Meanwhile, the Firefly's success only deepened among Allied ranks. Commanders praised its precision and reliability. In their reports, they often marveled at how easily it dominated enemy armor, comparing its 17-pounder gun to a scalpel among hammers. But there was also a quiet respect for their opponents, a recognition of the courage it took for any Japanese crew to enter a battle they knew they could not win. War, after all, was not just about machines, it was about men. And even the most advanced weapon could not erase the human cost of its power. By the time Japan's defenses collapsed and the war neared its end, the Firefly had left an indelible mark on the memory of every soldier who faced it. To the Japanese, it became the symbol of inevitability, the proof that their empire, once thought invincible, could be undone by the cold precision of steel and industry. To the Allies, it was a triumph of engineering, a tool that had saved countless lives by ending battles swiftly and decisively. But beneath the triumph and defeat, there remained a haunting truth. Every blazing every shattered crew, was a testament to how far humanity had gone in perfecting destruction. The Firefly's thunder echoed across the dying empire, not as a sound of victory, but as the requiem of an age that believed courage alone could stop progress. When the war finally ended and the fires of the Pacific fell silent, the memory of the Firefly and the Chi-Nus lived on in the stories of those who survived. The battlefield may have been reclaimed by jungle and sea, but the echoes of that mechanical duel, of fire against steel, of courage against inevitability, remained etched in the minds of the men who witnessed it. The Sherman Firefly had proven to be more than just a tank. It was a symbol of what modern warfare had become, a contest no longer decided by sheer bravery or willpower, but by precision, technology, and industrial might. The Japanese called it the thunder that strikes once, a weapon so lethal it seemed to defy nature. The Chi-Nus, once heralded as Japan's great hope, became instead a tragic monument to the futility of trying to match industrial giants with limited means. After the war, Allied engineers and historians studied the wreckage of Japanese armor scattered across the islands. They noted the thinness of the steel, the crude welds, and the desperate improvisations made in the final years. Many of the Chi-Nus never even saw combat. They sat idle in warehouses or buried in defensive positions around Tokyo, waiting for an invasion that never came. The Firefly, by contrast, would continue to serve for decades, its 17-pounder gun a masterpiece of wartime design. Even in Korea and beyond, its legacy endured, a reminder that the evolution of warfare had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. For the Japanese soldiers who had faced it, the Firefly's power became the embodiment of a haunting truth. They had fought in a war where courage had met its limit. Their ancestors had believed that spirit and sacrifice could overcome any enemy. But on the battlefields of 1945, spirit could not stop a shell moving at 3,000 feet per second. The realization was devastating. The old warrior ethos, the Bushido code that glorified honor in death, was left powerless against the relentless precision of the modern battlefield. It was as if centuries of tradition had collided head-on with the future, and the future had won without hesitation. In the years that followed, veterans on both sides spoke of their encounters with a quiet melancholy. American tankers remembered the Firefly with pride, but also with unease. They knew what it could do. They remembered the smell of burning fuel, the silence that followed after an enemy tank vanished in a ball of fire. They carried the memory of what it meant to wield such destructive power. Many admitted that the Firefly didn't just destroy enemy tanks. It erased them, leaving nothing but twisted metal and blackened earth. To pull the trigger was to unleash a force that no human could truly control, only aim. Japanese survivors, on the other hand, spoke less of their defeats and more of their awe. Those who had seen the Firefly in action described it as a machine possessed. One tank commander who survived the Battle of Luzon wrote decades later that it was not the enemy's courage we feared. It was his silence. The Firefly did not roar, it whispered, and men died. His words captured what technology had done to the essence of battle. It had stripped it of the chaos and clamor that once defined it, replacing it with mechanical precision and finality. As Japan rebuilt in the post-war years, the lessons of the Chi-Nus and the Firefly became part of its quiet reckoning. The nation that had once glorified the sword now embraced the forge of industry, understanding that strength no longer came from spirit alone, but from innovation and mastery of technology. The same engineers who had once struggled to design tanks in secret workshops now turned their skills toward peaceful creation, building machines that would lift their country from ruin instead of dragging it deeper into war. For historians, the story of the Fireflies' dominance over the Chi-Nus was more than a tale of two tanks. It was the story of an era ending. The age of romantic warfare, of valor against odds, had been replaced by an age where machines decided fate before men even saw each other. The Firefly had been the messenger of that change, a weapon that signaled the dawn of mechanized supremacy. Every battlefield it crossed became a graveyard for the old world, and every shell it fired marked the birth of a new kind of conflict, one defined by range, accuracy, and industrial power. Today, when one looks at the rusted remnants of those machines, half buried in tropical soil, their steel frames consumed by time, it is hard not to feel a sense of reverence. They are not just relics of war, they are reminders of transformation. The Firefly and the Chi-Nus were born from two very different worlds, one fueled by limitless production, the other by dwindling faith. But they met on the same killing fields, and together, they wrote the closing chapter of a brutal century's most defining conflict. The Firefly's roar faded long ago, but its echo remains, a reminder that in war, progress is both a weapon and a wound, and that every leap forward in technology leaves behind a trail of men who could not keep up.